Stuff. It's been a harrowing few weeks, harrowing few months of news. There've been some good news stories, but they've been few and far between. And I suppose one of the things that normally would be a bit of a good news story for a government, a newly elected government, would be the Queen's speech, which we start with today. But hasn't been such a good news story, has it, Jonathan, for Theresa May this week?
Well, clearly she did not get the majority that she was seeking, and the Queen's speech was not exactly what we might have anticipated in terms of putting into effect everything that was in the Conservative manifesto, because clearly they do not command the majority in the House of Commons and need to be slightly more selective about what they put forward. But at the same time, it's a very, very important Queen's speech because there are no less than 8 bills in it relating to enacting Brexit. And Brexit is obviously the most important thing on the government's agenda. And the House of Commons is going to spend a lot of time over what is now a 2-year legislative programme.
And that's been done before. That's not unprecedented.
Yes, it's done in 2010, yes. Because and in fact there is an argument that having the parliamentary sessions year by year in this very strict manner isn't actually very sensible for the governing of the country and for legislating for the country. That increasing you get bills carried over from one session to the next anyway. So,
and it's particularly with very complicated bills, as you say, like these 8 Brexit-related bills that will take a longer time. Peter, I mean, it is a very strange set of affairs, isn't it, to have this election and then to have the Queen's speech. We've got delayed, of course, because we're waiting for a deal with the DUP, with the Tories. There wasn't a deal, still isn't a deal, may never be a deal, we don't know. And yet we went ahead with the Queen's speech. And then we had this strange debate in the House of Commons, where I watched in the afternoon because I'm one of those weirdos. I imagine you two probably are as well. Talk Radio listeners, far too sensible to do that. They've got jobs and places to be. But to see a Prime Minister sort of announcing the Queen's speech as Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn having done so well but still being the leader of the opposition, it was a very strange time in the House of Commons.
Well, good afternoon. It's all changed massively, hasn't it? For Theresa May, it was the crowning moment, really, of her humiliation. All these policies dropped from the manifesto, and for Jeremy Corbyn it was another stage in his evolution from kind of bearded Marxist threat to the nation and capitalism to now the lovable grandfather next door who might just be right about tweaking a few elements of the economy. So as we see from this, a lot of this is about the pace of your travel. Everyone knows Jeremy Corbyn speeding up. For want of a better word, there is momentum behind him, whereas Theresa May slowing down. She seems sapped of political energy, really, whether that's in the country, in the media, or in her own party. And just briefly, look at the list of all the things that were left out from the Queen's speech. I hardly have enough breath to read them all out, but it's Donald Trump's state visit, grammar schools, the dementia tax, fox hunting, scrapping universal free school lunches, means testing winter fuel payment, a watering down of the pensions triple lock, and the energy price crap. What a disaster.
But presumably, Peter, you're quite happy about that, because you didn't want any of those things enacted, and now it's not going to happen because of the verdict the people gave.
I'm not the Prime Minister. I think if the Prime Minister runs a general election campaign, have a bad promising XYZ and can't deliver it, then that raises even more questions about how tenable she is. She has failed.
But there's no doubt at all about that. She has failed. The question is what happens now. I mean, whether or not she gets to deal with the DUP or not. At the end of the day, she is more capable of forming a government and constitutionally entitled to do so than... That's a silly thing to say. There is a government.
She hasn't formed a government. She's appointed a cabinet. She hasn't done a deal with the DUP.
In what way do you think there's not a government? I don't even understand what you're saying.
It's literally true. She hasn't formed. She's appointed her ministers.
Yes,
she hasn't
that's a government.
She hasn't done a deal with the DUP.
Why? But she doesn't. Yeah, but she doesn't. No, they don't need to do a deal with the DUP. You could be a minority government. We've had plenty of minority governments in the past.
But she's not said that. The intention, as it stands, is to do a deal with the DUP, and she still hasn't done that.
But that doesn't mean she hasn't formed a government.
Well, I don't think it's a government in any recognisable form.
We've had plenty of governments of similar ilk.
But
you remember, I know you're probably a bit too young, but I certainly remember the late 1970s because my parents worked in that minority
But then
government.
You have to either say we're doing a deal and then complete it, or we're not doing a deal, we're a minority administration and all comers can take us on. She hasn't done either of those things.
We're waiting to see. We'll wait till we actually have some votes. But of course, Jonathan, coming back to you, next week we'll have the first votes, won't we, on the Queen's speech. There's always a formal vote in Parliament now. presumably she took out all of the items which Peter has quite rightly listed that she thought were controversial, the grammar schools and the fox hunting. How on earth that ended up in the manifesto? Who knows? Absolute nonsense. But she's taken out anything she thinks controversial, and she's just going to put through the stuff which she thinks she can get through Parliament. The idea, presumably, is that there isn't anything in that Queen's speech that she isn't pretty darn sure she can get through, because if the Queen's speech voted down, the government will fall, won't it?
No, that's true. But the Queen's speech is not going to be voted down, because there are, the DUP, regardless of whether or not a deal happens with them, and I think there probably will be some arrangement, but it's clearly not a formal coalition. It was never going to be a formal coalition. But the DUP are not going to do anything that's going to raise the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn getting anywhere nearer to number 10, because they despise him and John McDonnell probably more than most.
But then wasn't it a mistake for her to even attempt to form a government with them, to rely on a sort of any sort of deal with the DUP? Why did she feel the need to do that?
Weakness.
Weakness. Surely that's a fair point from Peter, isn't it?
I guess in the day after the general election, when she made that announcement, she was trying to steady the country's nerves. At the end of the day, the DUP, may sign a confidence and supply agreement, or they may make decisions on a vote-by-vote basis as to what to support. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference, I think, in the end. And as you say, in terms of trying to command the majority in the House, Theresa May has infinitely higher prospect of being able to do so than Jeremy Corbyn does with his number of seats.
I mean, of course, the biggest issue, as you mentioned, Jonathan, earlier, was that all these Brexit bills that are related. Are we anywhere near, do you think, getting to a position where the majority of people in Parliament, the parties, can agree in any way on what the Brexit deal is that we want? Because it does seem, although there'll be differences across the EU 27 states, and indeed even between those doing the negotiating, we've heard different things from the likes of Michel Barnier, from the EU, Guy Verhofstadt, Jean-Claude Juncker, and others, and what they say in public, what they say in private, what they say in a tweet, they're all very different. But how have we got any closer at all to coming up with what we actually want from Brexit 1 year on from that vote?
Oh, for sure. And there's actually far more common ground between the Conservative and Labour parties on Brexit than either would publicly acknowledge. If you look at the manifestos of what they were promising, it was utterly clear. Both were committed to coming out of the single market because they talked about ending free movement of people, which is sacrosanct as far as the EU is concerned, and you can't remain in the single market and end free movement. Similarly, talking about the new trade deals that they want to negotiate going forward. You can't negotiate trade deals with other countries unless you are outside the customs union. So there's actually a lot of common ground there. I think there's obviously, in terms of rhetoric and tone, there's difference in terms of what the two major parties are talking about, but the fundamentals of the government's white paper from before the general election still stand, and that is what Theresa May is pursuing.
And that's what David Davis went in to talk about with Michel Barnier. What do you make of it, Peter? Because this is the thing, is that people seem to forget, and of course, while people are cheering, Jeremy Corbyn, as they will at the Glastonbury Festival, we were just talking about that before the midday news, how wonderful he is, and there'll be keen Ramonas and Remainers, different kinds of people. They seem to completely forget the fact that Jeremy Corbyn is actually absolutely in his heart a Eurosceptic, has been all his life, barely campaigned for Remain, as he was sort of asked to do by Labour MPs ahead of the campaign last year. The reality is that there is this different emphasis, both from Labour and indeed from the likes of the Tory Chancellor, Philip Hammond, in terms of what we mean by coming out of the single market and what the priorities are, whether it's cutting immigration or whether it's helping on the issue of jobs. Now, these seem like subtle things, but actually they're quite specific, aren't they?
There's a lot of confusion, and I'm not going to explain it for you because no one can explain it. The electorate faces a choice on June the 8th between Labour's artful fudge and Theresa May's vacuum, and I don't think the electorate feels much more clued up now. On Corbyn, he does come from a Eurosceptic tradition, absolutely, very much in the mode of Tony Benn. But remember, on that Channel 4 programme, when he was asked to state his enthusiasm for the EU out of 10, he said 7, not 0. A Remainer like me can understand that, because I felt for all the problems with the EU, and there are a lot, a lack of democracy, a bit of a capitalist club, 7 sounded about right, and I worry that too much is being made of Corbyn's quote-unquote Euroscepticism. Of course,
he voted out in 75.
Yeah, a lot has changed.
But if the reasons to vote out in 75 would be magnified thousand-fold to vote out in terms of British sovereignty.
Why does that matter now? How he voted in 75?
Well, because he's been a Eurosceptic all along. The only time he's never even actually answered how he personally voted, has he?
No, he said he voted to stay in.
I don't think he said. I think it was more of a nuanced answer than that, was it? Well, certainly the first few times he was asked.
Yeah, well, not for the first time. Jeremy, I think, had a little bit of problem getting his point across, and that led to a lot of negative headlines. I'm pretty sure Corbyn voted to remain in the EU. I think you can make criticism of the leader, but I wouldn't accuse him of lying over the referendum.
Okay. Look, we're going to talk about the Brexit talks and the EU summit and this promise over EU citizens in just a few minutes. But just finally, on the issue of Theresa May, I can ask you, Peter, and Jonathan afterwards. The big thought ahead of this election, from what the pollsters were saying, I wasn't out on the doorsteps. I only had what the pollsters and the people who were out on the doorsteps were saying, which was that it was going to be a big Tory majority. They were saying, look, this is going to cement Theresa May's position, and Jeremy Corbyn, well, he might face another leadership challenge, and question marks about if he hadn't proved that he could win votes, he would have to go. Not that necessarily meant he would go. Peter, do you think, now we pretty much see Jeremy Corbyn cemented in place, do you think that Theresa May is in place? Do you see her leaving in the next few weeks, months, years?
Not necessarily. That's the interesting thing about this issue. We all know Theresa May is essentially fatally wounded politically, but I don't think she's going to go anytime soon, because we've got Brexit, we've got the other Tory potential candidates slightly stepping back from the brink, as Boris Johnson did this week, saying he wouldn't mount a challenge for a couple of years. And also, for all the Brexit talks and the economic shock that could lead to, it's clear that a challenger might not want to take over yet. Sometimes the challenge in the media is that the most dramatic story is what doesn't happen. And I think while Theresa May is toast, she'll be around for some time yet.
What do you think, Jonathan?
I actually agree pretty much with everything Peter said. I think
this is going to be the only time today. Should we get that on record?
I think there's no appetite in the Conservative Parliamentary Party for a leadership contest. I've spent quite a lot of time in Parliament the last week talking to people on all sides, actually. And, there's no appetite for a leadership contest. It would bring uncertainty and division just when the country needs a bit of steady hand on the tiller. And, the Brexit negotiations are hugely important, and obviously there's several people who are potential candidates in the future who would be involved in those Brexit talks, so it will be a huge distraction. That's not to say that I don't think there's
They're not manoeuvring.
I don't think there's any denying that there is not an expectation that Theresa May will fight a general election again.
Exactly. Yeah.
So she's here for now, but just until it's safe to get rid of her. Basically.
The interim Prime Minister, as one Labour MP said.
Interim Prime Minister, indeed. Well, 12:17 is the time. This is Talk Radio.